So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I propose that we start without first panel of this afternoon whose title is Illiberal Regimes Accessing to Institutions, Observation and Modelization. So, we start avec the talk of Luca Tomini, who is professor of political science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and whose speech is titled The Autocratization Plateau, the New Phase of Democratic Decline. I remember that you have 20 minutes. Yeah. So, Luca, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. I will try to stay in the 20 minutes. Maybe just move the button. So, okay, thank you very much thanks for the attention. So, the autocratization plateau. I will say, before I start, just a very short disclaimer. This is a work in progress, and this will be a kind of overview based on some data that are collected in the last couple of weeks. So take it like an introduction to the problem. And the paper and the presentation has a single and very small message. So you can take it or not, but is at the same time a very general overview, but with a very single contribution. So at the beginning of this conference, we talk about the evolution of the debate, in the last 15, 20 years. We talk about the debate in the 90s and the recent discussion, since Viktor Orban, in 2010 election and on the idea of democratic backsliding, regression, decline, autocratization in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So there is a huge debate about that. I've been into this debate in the last 10 years, so I try at one moment, I became, in a way, a bit skeptical. And I found that, we reach a consensus. So there is a consensus that there is a democratic decline all over the world. Okay, I just mentioned some couple of quotes here. The very recent one on the Journal of Democracy, and then someone at the beginning this morning mentioned Freedom House, VDEM, Report, and all of them point in the same direction. Basically, the third wave of autocratization is deepening and spreading and continue to deepen. And Stefan Lindberg recently published an article. Stefan Lindberg was the director of the VDEM Institute in Gothenburg, saying on Democratization Journal, saying that no sign of an end to the current wave of autocratization. So the message is clear. There's no end in sight. And I ask myself at one moment, is this true or not? What is actually happening? And that's the purpose of this paper. So you might be familiar with the VDEM report or Freedom House report, and this is something that you can see in the last year reports, 2025 and 2026. Basically, you see what I was mentioned before. You see a period where we have a slow democratic improvement in the 19th and beginning of the 20s, and then we saw this clear downward trends of global democracy indexes starting in 2010, 2012, and recently an acceleration of decline in the last 10 years. So this is based on VDEM data. This is based on the global average democracy all over the world. So as I said, Phase 1, slow democratic growth. Democracy was still improving, but at decelerating pace. A second phase of emergent democratic decline, where democratic recession and all the debate started about decline of democracy and autocratization. And the phase 3, the most recent one, accelerated decline. So where decline of democracy accelerated and deepened. So the question is, if the data are so clear about, the fact that there is a decline, why do I have a paper that is entitled The Autocratization Plateau? the question is more complex than it seems. And I guess we need to refer to what Daniel Kellerman said in the presentation, in the discussion. The first point is that we need to be more attentive on how we define the process we want to study. When we talk about democratic decline, autocratization, backsliding, etc., my main point here is everything is autocratization, nothing is autocratization. As you said, and I took note, we need to see clear project and path from democracy to autocracy in order to tell whether we are observing a real political change, and this is how I define autocratization, a process of political changes in autocratic direction that involve basically democracy and rule of law. Democracies as defined by classic Robert Dahl, participation and competition, and rule of law, Guillermo O'Donnell and the others, so accountability, horizontal interinstitutional accountability, vertical accountability, diagonal accountability. So if we observe decline in these three dimensions, so then we can talk about autocratization. So, and if we move from a very general assessment of global decline of democracies using aggregated index to a more fine-grained assessment, still quantitative, still limited, but quite different, focusing on autocratization processes, basically episode of autocratization, where we have a substantial decline, where we observe a substantial decline of this in this dimension. So the picture starts to be a little different. So these are the number of autocratizing countries in the last, since the 90s, the early 20s. So we see an increasing number of autocratizing states, but what we also see in the last 5 years is that this number has flatlined. And this is a very interesting issue because we see the rapid rise and we see a peak and then a flat line after 2019. More interestingly, if we disaggregate between the ongoing cases of autocratization, so a country entering an episode of autocratization and becoming more and more and more autocratic, staying there, and every year, new country becoming in this, entering this process, the picture becomes even more interesting because we see the flattened line, but we also see that the new cases of autocratization in the last 5 years has decreased. So the first message is that there is in the data a fundamental shift after 2019. So democracy is still declining globally. Global democracy score continuing to fall, and the countries in autocratization episode are higher than ever. Okay. Even more interesting, the erosion in affected countries is accelerating. So, in a way, the pessimistic assessment is justified. But the point is that in the data show that dynamics have changed. Autocratization has stopped spreading to new countries. Instead, it is intensifying in countries already in the process. There is a very limited number of new episodes in the last 50 years. And in a way, there has been a lot of discussion about a wave of autocratization. To me, this wave reached a plateau. It doesn't mean that it started declining, it started moving back, but it basically reached a new equilibrium, which is more autocratic than before. But it's not deepening and spreading, as the consensus is saying. Basically, the spreading versus deepening is like intensive versus extensive autocratization. So decline of democracy produced by countries in the process or already in the process since many years of new countries entering a process of autocratization has changed. So for 2 decades, basically spreading and deepening coexisted. Right now, we see that the most relevant contribution to global decline is from ongoing episodes. is no more from new episode. This plateau is also not uniform across region. There are some regions where we can clearly observe the plateau, Latin America, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and worryingly, there are regions like Western democracy and Eastern Europe where the plateau has not been reached so far. So in the paper, I ask also myself the question, so what, if this is true, if this, if we reach a plateau in terms of countries autocratizing, what might be the explanation? And I try to test 3 different hypotheses. The first was very simple, is pool saturation. Basically, the wave of autocratization, of global decline, has simply exhausted the supply of democracy, of vulnerable democracy, that are prone to erosion. And this is proved by the data that as we have done. The second was an hypothesis about democratic resilience. I said, yeah, maybe the democracies have learned by cases of autocratization, and democracies have improved the quality of their institution. And this is not true. Instead, we see, stable situation. The third hypothesis was maybe there is a declining in the capacity of autocratic countries to diffuse their forms of government practices. And I tested this through kind of proxy of contagion effect, the famous contagion effect, regional contagion. And this is in a way supported. So the picture we have is, I will say, quite interesting. Autocratization has changed in its nature, basically, in the last 5-6 years, and works a little bit like a funnel. So before 2009, we have a lot of new cases every year, a lot of new cases entering autocratization and contributing to the global democratic decline. After 2019, we have a narrow entrance. So we have less and less cases, few new cases, but once inside, the country move even more rapidly to authoritarianism. And that's the point. The exit for those countries that are in this episode is increasingly difficult and painful. And there's also a kind of consequence in terms of policy implication, because the old priority was, let's try to understand how we prevent autocratization. So how we protect vulnerable democracy, how we protect countries before they experience, before a leader win the election, an authoritarian leader win the election. How we make democracies more resilient. But if this is true, so if we are witnessing a situation where there are less and less new countries, and instead those that are inside are experiencing more and more decline, so the priority became how to reverse the ongoing episode. And this is also linked to a lot of evidence how countries move out episodes of autocratization, and linked to the recent debate on resistance, how to resist, and how to re-democratize after an episode of autocratization ends. So, for the conclusion, there will be a lot to discuss here, but I got several points here that need to be debated, I guess. Data show, data can be interpreted, there's nothing, that is out of, possible discussion, but we see a kind of plateau trend in the last 5 years. So number of affected countries stabilize. New episodes are mostly vanish, or very few of them. This is not the end of the crisis. I just want to be very clear on that. This is not the end of the democratic crisis. This is not the end of the danger for democracy, because the aggregate global democracy continue to decline, but it's driven by the intensification of the process instead of the spreading out of the process. And this is a crucial findings. And the post-saturation is probably the main driver, because the wave, the autocratic wave, consumed the already vulnerable democracies. Those that remain are the classic, countries that are the less likely case, actually. There is a worrying sign, though, that is what is happening in the US, what is happening in other Western democracies. Because we also see in the data that there is an end of this kind of democratic immunity for the West. This might mean that in the next couple of years, we might observe new autocratization. And if this is the case, new autocratization cases in the West, this autocratization will be probably like also in the US. So I remember you showed the data about the case in 2025. Right now, in the last VDEM report, the US is the countries where we observe the most rapid decline of democracy probably ever in Western democracy. So this is exactly the narrative, intensification instead of spreading. And if this is the case, we really need, and that's my final message, we really need to have a plan. In the sense that if resistance matter, so if it's, as the data show, if it's very hard and painful to exit from ongoing episode, we need to have a plan before it happens. And a plan means to think about what, in terms of legal means, political, social tools to resist a possible authoritarian leaders once in government. So that's it. Thank you very much.